In the previous section, we introduced our basic if statement. So what this is doing is it tests one condition, and if that evaluates to true, we execute some code. If that evaluates to false, we do nothing. Then we introduce the else clause, which allows us to execute some code if that first condition is false. However, in both cases, we're only actually testing one simple condition. There will arise situations where we need to test multiple different conditions and write multiple cases for when each condition is true and the others are all false. For that, we'll need to introduce the else if statement, which we're going to cover in this section. So this will allow us to test for multiple different conditions and different values, and then we're going to compare this to simple multiple ifs. So the else if syntax looks a bit like an if statement combined with the else clause. I think rather than just talk about the concepts, let's just launch right into our example. And we're actually going to use the same example from before because I feel like it's still quite appropriate to talk about it now. And this is off the button press, so we have a left or a right button. Okay, so let's just zoom out, we'll create our variables. There's just a single constant, which is going to be our button pressed of type string, and it's going to be right again this time. And we'll have our variable, which is going to be player position. Okay, and it's going to be of type int, and it's set equal to 0 again. Now, in the previous example, we assumed that our button press is either left or right, okay, and there are no other possible values. However, this isn't realistic. There are dozens and dozens of buttons on your keyboard, so the user could be pressing any one of them, and we haven't written the conditions for that. In the previous section, we had it move the player's position 1 to the right, or increase it by 1 if it's right, and then we just said else move the player to the left. Well, if we were to do the same thing here and assume that our button can take on multiple different values, then that's going to move our player to the left when even when the user presses a key such as the number 4 or the letter F. It's going to move our character to the left, and that's not necessarily what we want. So in this case, we want to test to see if it's right, then we want to see if it's left, and then if it's nothing else, we can write some default code. So we'll start with our simple if statement again, and this is just going to be if button pressed equals right. Okay, in this case we're going to increase our player position again by 1, so plus equals 1, and then before we had the else, player position plus or minus equals 1. Okay, this is what we had before. Now again, this doesn't really cover very many cases. It's just testing once and then saying if all else fails, then we're going to do this. But we do want to test to see if the button pressed is now equal to left. So instead of the else, we're actually going to say else if button pressed equals left. Okay, and then in this case, we're going to do this. So as you can see, it's basically the else with another if statement. So in this case, we're actually performing two tests. Well, sometimes we execute both tests, but either way, we're not just giving some kind of default case. So as before, with the else clause, we only actually execute this if our first test fails. So if this test passes, we simply skip over everything here. If this test fails, we then perform our second check, our second test here. So that's a big difference between the else and the else if. The else if is testing yet another condition, whereas the else clause is kind of like a default. It's kind of like a fail-safe that says if nothing else passes, if all of our tests fail, we need to do something, so we're going to execute this. In this case, it might also be appropriate to add an else clause in, and then we can just not change player position. Perhaps we just want to print something like invalid key. Okay, or invalid button. Okay, so something like this might be a little more appropriate than what we had before, because we're assuming that the user is probably going to press either left or right, but there's a chance that they are going to press a different key, and we just want to say that we don't recognize that particular key press and do nothing. And this is more the behavior that we want, rather than just saying, okay, well, if the user presses right, we'll move right, and if the user presses any other key, we'll move the player left, which is what we had in the previous section. Now, I just have the one additional clause here, the else if, but we can chain these together to have multiple different else ifs. So, for example, if our player position had an x and a y value, so we had player x position, okay, and a player y position, so just copy that. Now, perhaps we want to test for right, left, up, and down values. So we're going to say if the button pressed equals right, we're going to change our X position by 1. If the button pressed is left, we'll change the X position by 1 again, but in the opposite direction. And then we're actually going to have a few additional clauses. So I'm just going to copy these to save a bit of time. Okay, and we're going to go else, okay, and then just paste them in here. So now if the button pressed is up, we'll increase our Y position by 1, and if the button pressed is down, we'll decrease the Y position by 1. Okay, and then if all else fails, we'll again just say invalid button. So we're only focused on directional keys for now. Okay, so that is the benefit of our else if. It allows us to test multiple different conditions. So this chain would read, okay, if our first test passes, then we'll exit out of everything and we'll ignore all of these. If our first test fails, we're going to perform the second test. Okay, again, if that passes, we execute this code and then exit out, ignoring this stuff, and so on and so forth. The chain continues down until finally we would reach our else clause and say, okay, well, all of these tests failed. The user has pressed something that is not right, left, up, or down, so we're just going to print invalid button. So that's your else if clause. It is a little different from just specifying additional if cases. Now the difference really is in the fact that our else if might not be tested at all, so we might never reach this else if statement, whereas if we were to write an additional if statement, we would reach that every single time. So let me just show you a pretty quick example here. I'm just going to say button pressed equals up, okay, and then we're going to say player Y position, actually it should be player Y position plus equals 1. Okay, and let's say that our button pressed equals left. So the difference here is that we are failing our first test. In this case, we're failing our first test. We reach our second test. We say, okay, the button pressed is left. We're going to increase player X position or decrease it by 1. And then we're simply going to skip all of this. So the compiler treats it as if these 3 lines do not exist. Well, once it starts running the code, it performs just these 2 checks and then skips over these. The difference is if we added this additional if clause, okay, so if we used if rather than the else if, this test would still go through regardless of the results of any of these tests, okay? So if we just use a bunch of if statements instead of the else if statements, it would test every single condition every single time regardless of the outcome of the previous tests. The else if is only executed if the test before it fails, whereas the if test will be executed additionally every single time. Okay, so while this isn't usually a problem, there are certain situations where this can really screw up the program we're trying to write, and also just leads to unnecessary checking. In this case, I shouldn't need to perform this extra check because I have my conditions here, and I know that if my player X position increased by 1, then I don't need to bother checking these because the button press does not equal any of these values. Okay, so that is your basic else if and the multiple if statements. However, there are still more topics to discuss when it comes to our if statements and their variants. So we're going to get into those, so this next section is actually going to be the last section that deals with if statements. Then we can look at some slightly more advanced forms of control flow.